Welcome to the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions and Sustainability Talk Series. My name is David Hart. I'm the director of the Mitchell Center, and it's great to have you with us. It's my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Kate Koff. Kate has deep roots in Maine. Her family goes back 8 generations on MDI, and that's not counting her daughter, but I'll save that for later. She's left the state a few times, including when she did her undergraduate degree in anthropology at Bryn Mawr in the Philadelphia suburbs and her master's in journalism at Columbia University. Even more impressive as far as I'm concerned, she rode a bicycle from Portugal to Zanzibar. And that's not the typical route by which people who've left the state try to find their way back home. But I got here via New Zealand, so what do I know? Kate has played many roles as a journalist, including with the Ellsworth American. She's now the editor of the Maine Monitor, which is a wonderful, nonpartisan, nonprofit, investigative news outlet. They give all of their work away for free. They don't have a paywall. And I was going to leave this out, but at a very young age, I worked for a newspaper, which is to say in about the 3rd grade, I sold my brother, who was a journalist his entire life, started writing news stories probably when he was about the 6th grade. And when I was in the 3rd grade, it was my job to sell his newspaper by going door to door in our neighborhood. So partly because of my brother and partly because I think the Maine Monitor is so wonderful, I also am a financial supporter of their wonderful work. At an early age, Kate also developed strong connections to the wonderful natural world that is all around us in Maine, including via childhood adventures paddling by moonlight with her family in Scarborough Marsh. There were so many different important subjects in which she could have spoken, but I was especially delighted when she offered to talk about the past, present, and future of electricity generation in Maine. Please join me in welcoming Kate to the Mitchell Center.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that one. That was maybe the best and most comprehensive introduction I've ever been given. So as David said, my name is Kate. I am the editor of the Maine Monitor. He gave you a little bit of information about our work, but as he mentioned, we are a nonprofit partisan news outlet focused on in-depth and investigative reporting. We're based in Hallowell, but we have reporters all over the state. We do give away our work for free. We have no paywall, but we also give it away to news organizations who want to republish it, so they can do that for free. You may have seen our bylines in the Bangor Daily News or the Portland Herald and the New Public. We do a lot of partnerships with them. And I am just actually going to start by giving you a very brief overview of how I came to her.
Put the map, okay.
I think he's gone to sleep. Okay, let's try this. There you go. All right. So I'll just start by giving you a brief overview of how I came to cover energy and environmental issues. My interest in this actually goes back quite a ways. I grew up with an engineer. My father's an engineer. He's a proud UMaine graduate. And he spent most of his career working on interconnection issues all over the world. And systems design and helping companies who wanted to connect to the grid figure out how they needed to design their systems. So I did grow up in a household where there was probably more discussion around power lines than there are in most households. But I didn't start really looking at this until I began my career in journalism at the Ellsworth American. And I started at the Ellsworth American in 2017. And for those of you who might remember, that was around the time there was a lot of discussion around solar energy in Maine, and particularly around net metering policies. And so we were starting to see at the time that I started there, a huge influx of solar development all over the state. And I was covering the the city of Ellsworth and Hancock County. And Hancock County, as you all might know, has a lot of open land, and it also had a lot of grid space. And so we were seeing a lot of these big commercial solar projects come in and want to site, in Hancock County. And I was watching, I was going to these town meetings and planning board meetings, and I was watching as these communities were really wrestling with very big questions about, what the future of these places would look like and whether or not they really wanted these large scale projects in their towns. And if they did want them, how would they regulate them? How would they make sure that, decommissioning was put in there? And it was a really interesting conversation to follow. And it brought up a lot of fascinating questions and tensions around sort of the future of renewable energy in Maine for me. I started a couple of years later at the Maine Monitor, and I took over as the energy and environmental reporter there in 2021. And as you all might remember, that was the year of the referendum on the Central Maine Power Corridor, or the New England Clean Energy Connect project. So there was also just a lot of really rich material to be mined at that point. I'm grateful that I started right as the referendum was, right around October. So I didn't have to cover the lead up to it, which I think is a very complicated thing for a journalist, but I did cover the aftermath of that topic. And it just, the conversation has obviously really exploded since then. So, one of the things that I have found in covering energy over the years is that there is a lot of confusion about some of the most basic parts of the system and just fundamental misunderstandings about how it works. And that's pretty understandable because it's a really complicated system. It's regulated by a lot of different entities at the state and federal level. And then you have sort of this local permitting process overlaid on it as well. So I get why people are confused. But I found that, particularly last year when there was the referendum on the consumer-owned utility, that I talked to a lot of policy experts and I talked to a lot of people in the engineering field and, had kind of a back and forth on that. But then I would talk to just, friends and neighbors and people in town. And I mean, there was a real basic lack of understanding on just how the system works. So when David asked me what I wanted to talk about, I said, I would like to talk a little bit about that. And I also really want to talk about how did we get this system that we have? Why did we have this difference between supply and generation? Why did we get that split? And what might that look like as we live in an increasingly electrified world, and how might that need to change? So this is a huge topic. Needless to say, we are going to leave a lot and not going to be able to cover everything. But I hope my goal today is that you leave with just a better understanding of how our grid in Maine came to be the way that it is and what the future of it might look like. There are a lot of different pathways, but what the future of it might look like. So I'm actually going to start in the present. It's going to be a little bit of a roundabout history so that we can have a shared understanding of where we are before we talk about how we got here. This is a great image, I think, that I got from the research firm Contrary. And you can see the 4 different colors on this image that show the 4 different major electric grids that covered the United States and Canada. In utility parlance, they're known as interconnections. And as you can see on this map, Maine is part of what's called the Eastern Interconnection, which operates east of the Rocky Mountains. There's another interconnection in the west, aptly named the Western Interconnection, which stretches north to the Alaskan border. Alaska, Texas, and Quebec have their own interconnections. And so these systems are connected, but they share very little power between them. The eastern and western grids are managed by what are known as operators, which are typically nonprofit organizations that coordinate and control electricity flowing through the system. Some operators cover a single state. Others, like the one that we have in New England, manage a larger region. Now, I'm just going to point out on this slide that Texas essentially has its own grid. We're going to talk mostly about Maine here, but I'm going to note this very briefly because Texas is a really interesting place in the energy sector. It's privatized its grid more aggressively than most other states. And that drive for the free market system has made it really easy to build and permit new infrastructure there, which has led to a lot of renewable energy development, but has also created a lot of problems. You might remember the major winter storm in 2021 when millions of people were without power for several days. And in a grid like we have in New England, there are regulations and safeguards that require a certain amount of reserve energy in case something goes, really badly wrong, like it did in Texas in 2021. But because Texas is more isolated and because they didn't enforce their any kind of reserve margin in the way that we have in New England, they also don't have the same kind of requirements to build infrastructure that can withstand major storms. So a lot of their lines are not insulated in the way that we have here. They don't have the kind of de-icers on the wind turbine blades that we have. So all of this led to sort of this catastrophic failure of the system in Texas in 2021 during that major storm. And we saw, millions of people without power and hundreds of deaths attributed to the storm. So before we talk about the grid itself and how the electricity actually gets from where it's generated to our homes and businesses and schools, let's talk a little bit about how it is produced. So we have 125 electricity producers in Maine. There are a lot of companies in this space, but a few major ones stand out, including Brookfield Renewables, which is a Canadian asset management company that's responsible for generating almost 90% of the state's hydropower and 21% of its wind power. Long Road Energy is another big player in Maine. They own numerous solar and wind projects across the state. So in Maine, the supply of electricity, meaning the wind turbines and natural gas plants and solar farms that are making the energy, that is regulated separately from the delivery of electricity, which is the poles and wires. Unless you choose your own electricity supplier, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, the price of supply is set annually by the Maine Public Utilities Commission after a competitive bidding process, which is different than the way that we set the price for the delivery of electricity. So this graph shows how we produced our electricity in Maine in 2023. As you can see, most of it, about 30%, was from natural gas, followed by hydropower at around 27%, wind at 21%, and biomass at 14%. Solar accounted for about 5% of energy production in Maine last year. Overall, Maine does not make enough electricity to meet the demand of all of our buildings and cars and homes and schools. So we also have to import it from other states. Because we don't make enough electricity, we bring it in from all over New England and from Canada. This is a graph that I pulled last Thursday afternoon when I was putting this together. You can get this information from the ISO New England website. We'll talk about ISO New England in a little bit. But you can see that this is the fuel mix in New England at 2:20 p.m. on September 19th, 2024. You could go and look at the updated graph of this right now. It would probably look pretty similar. This resource mix doesn't fluctuate too much. So you can see that in New England, we get our electricity primarily from natural gas. We get about 32% of it from nuclear power plants, 11% are renewables, 3% is hydro, and 1% is other. actually, I'm gonna go back real quick here. So I will also note that this is a very big change from the 1990s, when our electricity was primarily produced by nuclear power, coal, and power plants. I will also note that in Maine and most of New England, with the exception of Vermont, electricity supply companies are loosely regulated, which means that authorities do not tell them how much they're allowed to charge for the electricity they produce. They do still have to meet certain safety and emission standards. But they're mostly operating in the free market, and they can sell into the wholesale regional market, or they can sell electricity directly to consumers. So throughout New England, including all of Maine, except for parts of northern Maine, we have electricity that is flowing and is bought and sold through this regional grid and market that covers all of New England. So that means Maine customers can buy from suppliers both in Maine and outside of Maine, and Maine generators can sell their products throughout New England. The price of supplying electricity is determined by the free market, largely by the free market. So that means if you want, you can choose who's supplying your electricity by contracting directly with a generator. If you don't make any choice, you will automatically get what's called the standard offer, which in Maine is set by the Maine Public Utilities Commission, typically for a 12-month term. The vast majority of people, about 90%, choose the standard offer. And I was just saying to David earlier that I found that the billing aspect of this really trips people up, because you don't get a separate bill for your electricity generation and your electricity delivery. It all comes as one. The parts are separated out on the bill, but unless you're sort of paying attention and you look carefully, you may not notice that there are actually several different companies that are involved and are getting the money when you send, your check to CMP or Versant or whoever supplies your power. All right. Now let's move on to the actual delivery. And I realize this is kind of a difficult map to make out. The intent is not that you can read all these tiny little pieces, but it's just to give you a sense of where the major transmission lines are throughout New England. So this is a map generated by ISO New England of the New England transmission line system, both current and planned through 2032. So after electricity is generated by all of those plants that we just talked about and talked about, like a natural gas plant or a wind turbine, once you actually have that electricity, you have to put it into a transmission line to get it to where it needs to go. So transmission lines are designed to carry power efficiently at a high voltage over long distances between regions and across states. Once the electricity reaches the other end of the transmission line, it travels through a substation where it's converted to a lower voltage. And at that point, it can travel on what's called the distribution system, which are the local lines that you actually see attached to the buildings around here. So this in utility parlance is called the transmission and distribution system. You often hear it shorthanded to just the T&D system. And this is where CMP and Versant come in. They own the poles and wires, and they are responsible for fixing them when they break and making sure the grid can handle the energy that is flowing through it. They are also partly responsible for helping companies that want to generate electricity and connect to the grid, figure out how and where they're going to do that. It's called interconnection, and whether or not the substations and transformers and the lines that are around there can handle that increase in electricity. So the thing that makes the electricity system different from, most other aspects of daily life is that you cannot store electricity in significant quantities. You really have to keep it in balance. You have to keep the amount that you're generating and putting into the system about the same as the amount being consumed at the other end. Because if you don't, it can explode. And so this is where ISO New England, which stands for the Independent System Operator of New England, comes in. This is a photo I got from ISO New England, which has a lot of wonderful and detailed reading material on their website about what they do, if you are interested and so inclined. So this is a photo of the control room in ISO New England. And at the regional level, ISO New England coordinates who is selling power to the grid and when. ISO New England is a nonprofit organization. They are headquartered in Massachusetts, and they make sure that all of the energy that flows in is distributed properly, all over Maine and New England and elsewhere. And they make sure that it matches the amount that's being used by all of us in our homes. Most of Maine is under the umbrella of ISO New England. Parts of northern Maine, which do share power with Canada, are operated by the Northern Maine System Operator. ISO New England is what's called fuel neutral, meaning they don't care if it's coal or oil or solar, wind turbines or whatever that's producing the power. What they're really concerned with is what is, most reliable, what is cheapest, so they always deploy the lowest cost resource onto the grid first. And they do not tell generators what they can charge for the power they're producing. But they are monitoring power not only minute to minute, so that chart you saw a little while ago was, the fuel mix at that particular moment. But they are also responsible for monitoring the power flows and figuring out how this is all going to work in the future. Planning for, which plants are going to be retiring and which ones are going to be coming online, and making sure that all of that is going to be balanced out as it happens, and that we're not going to go without power. ISO New England doesn't plan to build specific projects, but they do work with states to figure out what kinds of generating resources and transmission lines will be needed and available in future decades, and how they're all going to contribute to getting the power where it needs to go. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk briefly about the entities that are involved in influencing and regulating all of this energy. So on the policy side, you have state and federal lawmakers who can enact legislation that incentivizes one kind of resource over another. So, I talked a little bit earlier about the net energy billing policies and net metering policies that help drive the adoption of solar in Maine. By paying people for the energy they produce with their rooftop panels. Or at the federal level, we have things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which offers tax credits to developers who want to build low emission electricity generators. So those are just a couple of examples of the ways in which, laws can help shape these energy transitions. We also, at the state level in Maine, we have some legislation that has directed transmission and distribution utilities like CMP and Versant to report certain metrics and develop their own climate action plans. So they can do things like that as well. We also have the Governor's Energy Office here, which is involved in developing programs and policies to help reduce our carbon footprint and to help make sure that we meet our renewable energy goals. And then we have the Maine Public Utilities Commission. Each state has its own Public Utilities Commission serving a similar function. And the Public Utilities Commission is responsible for regulating T&D utilities like CMP and Versant. So when those companies want to, raise rates or build new distribution lines or substations, or if they want to recover money they spent on restoring power outages after storms, they have to go before the commissioners, who also have a number of staff, to justify the costs that they want to pass on to us, the ratepayers. Commissioners are appointed by the governor, they are confirmed by the legislature, and they serve staggered 6-year terms. As I mentioned a little while ago, the PUC does not set rates for the production of electricity or for transmitting it through the high voltage system. Companies that generate electricity compete for those contracts in the open market. And the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is another regulatory body, determines the price of transmitting energy through the high voltage lines because they are crossing state and sometimes national boundaries. So FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which has been in the news more in the last few years than I've seen it in quite a while. They're an independent agency that regulates the transmission of electricity, natural gas, and oil. They were created in 1920 as the Federal Power Commission, primarily to control hydropower dams. But in the 1970s, they became FERC, and they got a big expanded mandate to regulate interstate electricity and hydroelectric projects and oil and gas pipelines. All right. So now I'm going to move on to a little bit of history. I'm not going to go all the way back to the 1880s, but just, just for reference, Thomas Edison got the patent for the incandescent light bulb in 1880, and 2 years later, we had the first complete electric power system launched in New York City. And basically, for many, many decades, the industry was made up mostly of utilities that handled every aspect of providing electricity. So they generated it, they transmitted it, and then they distributed it to homes and businesses. They were basically regulated local monopolies that operated independently of one another. Then on November 9th, 1965, we had a major blackout that shut down power to 30 million people across the Northeast, all because of a single transmission line failure near Toronto. And after that happened, people began to really worry about having all these major interconnected networks that were vulnerable to a single power line failure. And that prompted the creation of these entities that were designed to help manage power flows between these big networks and make sure that didn't happen again. So one of these organizations was called the New England Power Pool, which was developed by the region's private and municipal utilities with the goal of fostering cooperation and coordination among utilities in the 6-state region. And over the next 3 decades, NEPOOL created a regional power grid that now includes more than 300 separate generating plants and more than 8,000 miles of transmission lines. This system worked pretty well for a long time. But by the 1990s, we had a lot of regulators and officials who really started to worry that we didn't have a lot of competition in the market because we had these monopolies. And that meant there really wasn't much reason for utilities to improve their service or lower prices or invest in new facilities and technologies. And in New England, we had electricity rates at that point in time that were really among the highest in the nation. And we had this really old, still very old electric power infrastructure. So in the early 1990s, Congress and FERC, which oversees the electricity industry nationally, passed legislation that essentially allowed for the restructuring of this industry with the belief that, competition and the free market would really provide this renewal and, invigoration into this space. Shortly after that, in the year 2000, Maine passed what was known as the Restructuring Act, which required utilities to sell their generating assets. So up until that point, Central Maine Power, for instance, had, owned both the means to generate electricity like Wyman Station, and then they also owned the poles and wires. Now, after this act, they were forced to sell off those generating assets, and they retained only the ownership of the distribution system. And the thinking behind this was really that partly that people were really smarting from some very expensive failed nuclear projects. And lawmakers were really trying to get the ratepayers out from under those costs and from under being responsible for those costs. We didn't entirely get out of it. Some of that is actually still kind of included in your bill, but it's a little bit of another story. They also really wanted to just introduce this competition into the market. So opening the market up like that has really meant that because we now have private firms, like, Long Road and like Brookfield, as the ones who are investing in building these power plants and energy generators, that, customers like you and me are, for the most part, shielded from that investment risk, which we were exposed to in the 90s when they were building all these nuclear power plants. Maine, I mentioned Texas earlier. Maine did not go nearly as far as Texas in privatizing these markets, which really, just let the free market loose on the whole thing. And now we are in, 2021. So really, I would say up until the late 2010s, I'd say the conversation mostly revolved around what kind of incentives should be put in place for renewables to, get people to adopt them. But for the most part, I think the discussion around the actual delivery of power, it really kind of took a back seat. That went until this 2021 initiative, the Citizens Initiative, that appeared on Maine ballots, in which voters were asked to reject the project called New England Clean Energy Connect, which most people know as the CMP corridor. And I think, that vote really set off a very intense discussion that has lasted, still going on, around where transmission lines should be sited and who should pay for them. I'm not going to linger too long on NESCEC because I imagine most of you know a fair bit about it, but just briefly, it is a 1,200 megawatt transmission line that is going to send electricity produced by hydropower generators in Canada down to the New England electrical grid. NESCEC, filed its state and federal permit applications in 2017. And the project was supposed to start tree clearing in January of 2020 and have power flowing at the end of 2022. It got its permits, but it was rejected in a referendum, as you all might remember, in 2021, with 60% of voters voting to stop the project. The DEP did halt work on it, and it wound up in court. And in 2023, a jury in Cumberland County decided that it could continue, and it has been underway for a while now. I just checked last week, and the last report was in early July, and they said that access to the route is about 81% complete, and they had set about a third of the poles and wires. The project was originally expected to cost about $1 billion. It's now expected to cost $1.5 billion, in part because of court delays. That 2021 law also required lawmakers to sign off on new high impact transmission lines, with the idea being that the legislature should be a check on developers who wanted to push through projects in communities that oppose them. Also in 2021, we saw lawmakers create what was called the Northern Maine Renewable Energy Development Program. And they directed the Public Utilities Commission to seek proposals for a transmission line that would bring power from a very large wind farm up in Aroostook County to the New England grid, which is a planned wind farm. It's not there yet. The following year, in 2022, the PUC bid out that transmission line from Aroostook County to the grid. LS Power won that bid. And as I mentioned, as part of that 2021 law, they were required to get legislative sign off for the plans, which they did. Although some lawmakers said they felt unprepared for the vote because the full route of the planned line was not public. In July of last year, LS Power began meeting with communities along that proposed route for what was called the Aroostook Renewable Gateway Project. And if you followed this in the news at all, you'll know that they encountered a lot of opposition from local residents. A lot of it was reminiscent of the fight over NESCEC, and I think just, the tensions that we're seeing generally around the country, not just over transmission lines, but over all kinds of large scale energy projects. I think it's been really interesting in Maine to see, as we've, seen proposals for things like the wind port on Sears Island, and then these larger transmission lines and the commercial scale solar, that it's really, it's causing a lot of tension in many of these communities. And it's also, I would say, from a reporting standpoint, it's been really interesting to see kind of the split that's emerged in the environmental community among environmental groups around this. There were folks kind of on both sides, major environmental groups on both sides of all of these projects. And I think I would say one of the reasons that's happening is because for a long, long time, we had an environmental movement that was largely focused on sort of halting projects for good reason, because there had been a lot of marginalized communities that had been devastated through the siting of, by the siting of some of these coal and oil plants and transmission lines, which have run through really vulnerable spaces. But I think, we're now in this time when we have to build a lot of infrastructure really quickly in order to meet our renewable energy goals. And that's just creating a lot of questions about how we do that and who has to look at it and who is going to bear the burden of those projects. And then we are in November of 2023, and I am sure you all remember, you probably voted on it, this attempt to create a consumer-owned utility. So that was proposed, and then it died in a 70-30 vote. The Aroostook Renewable Gateway project was also pulled, although it has been revived a little bit, which I will talk about. And I actually, before we go on, I do want to just go back briefly to energy supply for a moment and just remind us of where we were before we talk about the future, where we were. So in 1990, you can see from this graph, we have nuclear, oil, and coal dominating electricity production in New England. We've got, 36% of our energy was generated by nuclear power plants, 34% was from oil, 16% was from coal, and 6% was from natural gas. That is a really striking difference to today, which you can see on the far side of this slide, where we have natural gas making up about 50% of our supply in New England. Nuclear is at 20%. We have imports around 13%, renewables at 10%, hydro at 8%, and then coal and oil less than 1%, which is a really remarkable shift. The shift to natural gas has been particularly interesting. You can really, I think there are a couple of reasons that this happened. We saw first, that opening of wholesale markets to competition in the early 2000s. I think, private companies really started to focus on natural gas because those plants are relatively inexpensive and easy to site. You just have one power plant and trying to build a wind farm or solar or nuclear plant, which can be very controversial. So they were much easier to permit. They were much easier to site. They were relatively, inexpensive to build. So I think we saw a lot of development of natural gas in New England in part because of that. They also do have lower carbon emissions compared to coal and oil. So they were helping states meet these renewable portfolio standards that were emerging at the time. So let's talk about the future. In basically any emissions reduction scenario, we're going to have to use electricity to power a lot more things. We're going to have to electrify our homes and our cars and our trucks in order to cut our greenhouse gases. There was this figure up top here comes from a pretty comprehensive study that was done by Princeton a few years ago that found that the United States will need to expand its electricity transmission systems by 60% by the year 2030, and that we may need to triple it by 2050. And it's worth pointing out, we can build as many wind farms and solar projects as we want, but if we can't get the energy to where it needs to go, they don't really do us much good. ISO New England has identified that the grid in New England is a potentially very significant bottleneck to progress in this space if it doesn't keep pace with the changes that we need to upgrade the power system. They do expect that upgrading our transmission and distribution lines will cost between 16 and 26 billion in New England alone. And I'll also just pause and point out that the power grid that we have now took about 150 years to build. And to get to net zero emissions by 2050, the estimates are that we need to build that amount of transmission again in the next 15 years, and then build that much more again in the 15 years after that. So it's just the scale of change is really huge. I stole this slide from a wonderful presentation from the governor's energy office because it's a nice layout of our renewable portfolio standard and our some of the energy policy requirements. So, Maine's climate goals include getting to 100% renewable energy by 2050 and to carbon neutral by 2045. We are already quite a long ways toward our carbon neutral goal, thanks to all of our lovely forests, which have done a lot of the work for us already. And we're also on track to meet our renewable energy goals until 2026, but the state does expect to need new resources to meet increasing goals thereafter. As you can see here, offshore wind is expected to play a big role in helping Maine meet these renewable energy standards. Hydropower, which has historically played a pretty big role in Maine, will still have a fairly significant place, but will likely diminish in comparison to solar and wind. And solar with battery storage will be a big part of the mix as well. So 2024, we have got a lot of money. There's a lot of federal money right now, billions and billions of dollars available for renewable energy projects, particularly through the Inflation Reduction Act. But as I said, it won't be of any use to anybody if you build those projects and you can't get the electricity where it needs to go. And so, as we've seen in recent years, it's really, really difficult to site new transmission lines because you not only need, permission, of course, from state and federal authorities, but you actually, in Maine, you need to get permission from all of these communities along the routes of these places, and that's really difficult because as much as people would like cheap, reliable electricity, most people do not want a transmission line in their backyard, right? And I should say also that this is not unique to Maine. This fight is happening all over the country, and there's increasing recognition from the federal government that there's going to have to be some sort of change at the federal level in order if we do want to build the kind of transmission that we'll need to reach these emissions reduction goals. So we saw a couple of really interesting things this year in particular. In May, FERC, which remembers that the federal agency in charge of interstate electricity transmission of gas and oil and electricity. So they approved changes that require grid operators around the country to plan 20 years into the future. The new rules also require operators to take into account changes in the energy mix and policies requiring wind and solar power. And they also require operators to take into account the risk that extreme weather poses to our grid. In July, Maine signed an MOU with 10 other Northeast states that basically says we're going to coordinate for the regional planning of transmission lines for the next several decades. And there is also a bill that's moving through Congress right now that has a pretty boring name, the Energy Permitting Reform Act, but that could actually have very big implications for the grid around the country. So broadly speaking, and this is one of those bills that has really divided environmentalists, it's a very messy compromise that would make it very easier to build transmission lines, but it would also give a pretty big leg up to the fossil fuel industry and open some public lands and waters to oil and gas leasing. It would also simplify the process of exporting natural gas. There are also efforts in Maine to make sure that utility companies are planning for more extreme weather as they're, as they're going around and doing the upgrades to all of these lines. They are now required to engage in integrated grid planning every 5 years, which is sort of exactly what it sounds like. It's just more wholesale planning for the grid of the future. And they are also required to file climate change protection plans every 3 years, starting in December of last year, with 10-year plans for addressing the expected effects of climate change on their own assets. And I'm mindful of the time. Before we open it for questions, I just want to go briefly over the pond to Germany. So I came across this article. I get a great newsletter from Bloomberg Green, and this was an article that they published a few weeks ago, where this chart was in an article that they published a couple of weeks ago about Germany's renewables build out. And so, we've all followed the war in Ukraine and, the consequences on that for Germany's energy sector. And Germany has really been obviously forced to wean itself off Russian gas really, really quickly. And so they were trying to figure out how to, speed up the build out of renewables there. But it has been, really complicated like it is in the United States. This story gave one example of a company that wanted to build 3 wind turbines in 2022, and they had to file more than 36,000 pages of documentation that was printed out and handed to authorities. And so starting in 2022, Germany passed several laws that were really geared towards speeding up this process. One law designated clean energy projects as a, quote, overriding public interests that serve national security. Another required German states to allocate about 2% of their land for wind turbines. And they basically sort of removed the involvement of an entire agency, which also really simplified the process. And they were pretty extraordinary changes. And as you can see from this graph, it looks like it's working as intended. Germany is that green line there, and you can see when they after they instituted these reforms, which it's only been a year or so, a couple of years, the build out of renewables just shot up, particularly compared to other regions of Europe. Yeah, I think that's a good place to end. And
can we all, wherever we're located, give another thanks and to this just wonderful, instructive talk. Thank you so very much for all of this information. Just very helpful. One of the things that we all are thinking about is, from your perspective, with all that your talk is so helpful. Who should we share this talk with? This talk will be on the web. And who do you see as not necessarily, what kinds of groups don't have this information that, boy, you're just a complete expert at? Who should we be thinking about? Thank you.
I would thank you for the question. I would hope that if you have somebody in your life who is frustrated with their utility bill, or just says like, I don't understand why this is so expensive, or what's happening here, I would hope you would share it with them. I hope that it can help just give people a little more context for how this is all working.
Great, thank you. Another question that people are asking about, given the complexity of everything that you've said, how can we, in our individual roles, best promote collaboration among policymakers, regulators, utility, etc.? Any advice for us in terms of next steps?
Oh, sure. I mean, so I am a journalist. I'm not an advocate, but I would say that if you care about, any issue, my inclination would be to start in your local community. I think it's very difficult to change policy at those, bigger national levels, particularly in a space like the energy space. But there's just a lot you can do to inform yourself and share that information with the people that your friends and neighbors. And I think as a journalist, I really believe that we can't have good discussions and robust debates on any of this unless we come from a place of shared understanding. We can disagree all day about what what the solutions should be. That's fine. I think that's really important to have those discussions, but we can't do that if we don't start fundamentally with just the knowledge of how it works and a little bit of history. Journalism is the first draft of history. So I think history is so important.
Your points are just so important and so good. Your audience, both on the in person and also on Zoom, and the people who will watch this later, includes lots of students, different majors. So as you're thinking about what you've learned and what you've seen, every major, do you have a thought about what they could contribute? Students majoring in journalism, what should they know or take away? In other words, how can we as a public education institution do a good job of having our students be prepared to play roles?
Approach things with an open mind. I try to do this with all my stories. I think, I have lots of thoughts and opinions about all kinds of things, the things that I write about, but I really try as hard as possible to approach the topic first and foremost, just with an open mind. Just, listen, you'd be so surprised about what you might learn from people and about these kinds of subjects. And it's often so much more complicated than you think. And I also tend to believe that, most people have good intentions. That I do think that. I think that most, we have all kinds of disagreements, but I would say that people are approaching things from a place where they want to find a solution. So.
That's great. Hey, Linda, can I do a couple from here?
You sure can.
Okay, Tom.
Hi, I'm interested in the comparison that was brought up a couple times between Maine's power grid situation and, for example, the power grid situations in Texas or Germany, and especially the extent to which Maine could unilaterally act. I mean, since Texas does, it's its own state, so it's making its own laws, but it does also have its own grid while we're part of that eastern seaboard. So how much can Maine do on its own without, say, parallel development in New Hampshire and Massachusetts and all the way down to Virginia, Georgia?
Well, we can do a lot. I think, we've seen, for instance, I keep coming back to net metering, but it's a great example. We saw the effect very dramatically of the policies that incentivize solar development in Maine and really push that gold rush. And so, I think we can certainly influence it in that way. In terms of sort of the larger regional grid planning, we have a seat at the table. Our regulators and lawmakers and officials are in those rooms, and our policies, like our policies on solar and wind, and particularly, it sounds like next week you're gonna hear from somebody who will talk about offshore wind, which is going to play a pretty big role, or is expected to play a pretty big role. That's a place where Maine is really, I think, driving a lot of the conversation in New England. But the system is layered and complicated for a reason, and I think it was designed that way, and purposefully not like Texas. Although there are people who are interested in what they've been able to do there, and I think there are some lessons that could be learned from Texas. But yeah, I mean, we are not isolated in that way. We cannot make those kinds of unilateral choices. So we can certainly drive the other states through our policies and influence that, but we can't sort of wholesale go off and say we're gonna just build this transmission line here, nor would we want to, I think, because we are all interconnected. We are sharing power. We need the electricity that is generated in the rest of New England. We don't have enough. So either we build more of it here, or we get it from them. So we are all, we're sharing here. Yeah,
Thank you.
This is a really good question. Yeah.
Second question from here, Linda, sound okay?
Sure.
Yes, thank you. That was a remarkable presentation. I really appreciated that. Your timeline ended in 2023. And this is 2024.
I have
Two
two
important
2024,
events.
yeah.
Two important events happened in 2024. The first is the retirement of the Constellation New Energy plant in Everett, Massachusetts. We lost 1,400 megawatts of low carbon combined cycle natural gas power. The second thing is on August 1st, ISO New England issued a level 1 emergency. And I see echoes of Texas in that, and it's not a very comfortable feeling. What's your opinion of the grid stability for the next year until the NECEC is completed?
I mean, sounds like quite a bit more about it than I do. So, I mean, I haven't seen the level 1 emergency.
They didn't issue it.
Yeah.
They didn't issue it until 6 days later.
Okay. I mean, my understanding is that the outlook is fairly good. I don't, I wouldn't want to worry people and say that we're going to have massive rolling blackouts in New England this winter. I don't think that sounds like it's a possibility. But certainly, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the retirement of the Everett plant and
How about that? Go on.
It's
Probably not the grid.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, the retirement of that plant is huge, and I think there are a lot of questions around how we're going to meet this increased load, and I'm not sure that I have a good answer, at least at this point. Yeah.
So I
One
think,
other,
if you got a quick one.
the other important part of that asset is a lot of the natural gas plants are pipeline constrained. That plant was not pipeline constrained because it accepted deliveries of LNG. It was a huge loss, and the plants may be available to meet the demand, but then in a minus 25 degree day, 3-day period, there could be problems this winter.
Yeah, I mean, ISO New England has said that they are really worried about the future, and we need these reliable resources, either solar paired with battery storage, or it's something that is going to be able to handle when we have all of our renewables offline. So I wish I had a better answer for you.
This was not to put you.
No, it's a really good question. Yeah.
I think we're gonna have to wrap it up because 4 is the official stop sign. But anybody that's got questions in the room, please come on up. You too, Francois.
Okay, I'll
Thank you.
do that.
Let's
Thanks.
thank Kate again for a wonderful